What manner of man is this? Or what manner of creature is it in the semblance of man? I feel the dread of this horrible place overpowering me. I am in fear, in awful fear, and there is no escape for me. I am encompassed about with terrors that I dare not think of.
Hey man, I gotta go soon.
But I just started reading. You said you always wanted to know the actual story of Dracula.
I didn't know it was gonna be this boring though. Look, I gotta get going. There's still time for interdimensional trick-or-treating. See you in another dimension.
You'll never change, bro. Well, it is Halloween. Maybe I'll just make a video on vampires instead. But none of that Anne Rice folklore Victorian style stuff. Let's talk about vampires in science fiction.
Strigoi, ghoul, abiifo, upir, lamia, vampire.
The idea of the vampire has existed for a very long time. In cultures from all over the world, they have been called by many names. But what is a vampire? Ancient cultures told stories of night-feeding spirits, but the figure we recognize as the vampire coalesced much later in Eastern and Central Europe. Folklore scholars point to the early 1700s as the moment the modern vampire takes shape, during a wave of reported revenants in the Balkans. The term itself likely comes from that region, and local variants like the Romanian strigoi or the Greek vrykolakas show how communities described corpse-like predators harassing the living and sometimes drinking blood, and sometimes devouring flesh. The spark that spread the vampire belief across Enlightenment Europe was a set of sensational case files. Officials documented exhumations and stalkings in places like Kisilevo and Meduina, where the infamous Petar Blagojevic and Arnold Paoli incidents took place. According to the stories, which were reprinted widely in newspapers, Petar was said to have risen from his grave in 1725. The locals claimed he returned at night and attacked his neighbors, and left them weak or dead. His body was exhumed, and it appeared unusually well preserved, with fresh blood around the mouth. Paoli was a man who was accused of vampirism around 1726 to 1732. He reportedly had claimed to have been attacked by a vampire himself before dying. After his death, people said he returned to feed on them. Empress Maria Theresa eventually sent her physician, Herad van Swieten, to investigate, and his skeptical report led to bans on grave desecration. Part of the panic came from misreading normal decomposition. Receding gums and sloughed nails can make a corpse appear fresh, which seemed to confirm that something was still moving in the grave. Archaeology and medicine helped to explain why the fear felt so real. Deviant burials like sickles laid across the throats or bricks in the mouth turned up from Poland to Venice, clear evidence that communities tried to keep suspected revenants from rising. Medical historians have also linked features of the legend to rabies outbreaks, which can cause biting and nocturnal agitation, and to porphyria, which can make sunlight painful and the skin fragile. Folklore was doing what it always does, translating grief, disease, and social stress into a story you can act on. Literature then locked the image of the vampire in place. John William Polidori's The Vampire, spelled with a Y, 1819, invented the seductive aristocrat Lord Ruthven, and Sheridan Le Fana's Carmilla, 1872, essentially you could say sharpened the template, this time with the female predator moving through drawing rooms and bedrooms. And of course, Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1897, gathered the lore into a rulebook: garlic, staking, earth from the homeland, mirrors, and the invitation rule. It also popularized the vampire as a foreign invader, hunting a modern metropolis. There is one famous rule that often gets attributed to Bram Stoker's Dracula that actually arrived later. In Stoker, sunlight weakens the count, but does not destroy him. The idea that the sun kills a vampire became canon through F.W. Morano's film Nosferatu, 1922, and then it spread to almost everything after.
Out of that history came the tropes we still recognize. The revenant that rises from the grave, the aristocratic seducer who preys in salons, the anti-plague toolkit of garlic, stakes, and decapitation, the threshold that must only be crossed by consent. Some pieces are folk medicine, some pieces are stagecraft and cinema. All are ways to name the same fear. That something can live on, draining us, and it knows our ways and our customs well enough to walk right up to the door.
At its core, the vampire is a being that feeds on life. Whether it drinks blood, drains vitality, or steals the soul, it's a creature defined by parasitism. Survival at the expense of the living. It exists in the threshold between life and death, a thing that should not be alive yet continues anyway. It violates boundaries we consider sacred, the grave, the body, the self. And that violation is what makes it compelling. Vampires are our anxieties made flesh. The fear of the corpse that will not stay buried. The fear of disease and decay spreading invisibly through a community. The fear of being used, dominated, or consumed by another human being.
The vampire myth survives because it adapts to whatever a culture is afraid of at the moment. That's why a vampire can be a bloated, rotting revenant in one era and a pale aristocratic seducer in another era. It can be a starving spirit in Western Africa, a plague corpse in Eastern Europe, a demonic lover in ancient Greece,
a metaphor for sexuality in Victorian novels, a metaphor for addiction in modern film. The core idea is the same, something that feeds on us and will not die. But there is another branch of the vampire that people rarely talk about, the science fiction vampire. Vampires imagined not as folklore undead, not as gothic seducers, but as biological or evolutionary phenomena. As predators in space, post-human offshoots of our own species, or alien intelligences that treat humans as livestock or fuel. We shouldn't simply ask, what is a vampire, but what does a culture need the vampire to be at any given time? In the age of technology and knowledge, what is a vampire? Part 1. I Am Legend. Richard Matheson's 1954 book, I Am Legend, drags the vampire out of Gothic shadows into mid-20th century science. Robert Neville, the last man on Earth, battles a kind of curse, but truly a worldwide plague. A bacterium turns people into essentially vampires, bloodthirsty, nocturnal, repelled by garlic and sunlight, driven to spread the infection. Matheson rebuilds vampire lore as science. Stakes kill by destroying the heart. Garlic triggers a physiological allergy. Mirrors and crosses work through conditioning, not the supernatural. By day, Neville researches the disease and hunts the comatose infected. By night, he hides in his fortified home, while former humans howl outside. This rationalization creates a new fear. The horror is an invisible pathogen that turns loved ones into killers. This novel was written in the Cold War's early years. I think the novel is channeling some anxieties about global catastrophe and scientific hubris. The plague's exact origins remain uncertain, but the book makes it clear that the vampires are victims of a bacillus. The interesting thing is that Neville's knowledge of what's happening reduces his moment-to-moment terror, but it brings about a bleaker insight. The truth is, the world belongs to the infection, and there seems to be no cure in sight. Isolation is another big part of what makes this novel really scary, in my opinion. Living alone in Los Angeles, overrun by monsters. Neville endures nightly taunts from his ex-neighbor, Ben Cortman. He faces the return of his dead wife, now a carrier of the disease. This is, of course, the trope of the familiar vampire from the grave. In Dracula, Lucy returns. It reflects 17th century fears that dead loved ones would awake from their graves. But here it becomes a pandemic tragedy. a loved one reclaimed by biology and not magic. In the book,
Neville eventually learns that there are two types of infected: reanimated corpses and the living infected who retain some function. He meets Ruth, who seems uninfected, but is a spy for an organized community of living vampires who use drugs to treat the disease. To them, Neville is the boogeyman, who by daylight massacres their sleeping kind.
he's eventually captured, and while he is awaiting execution, he takes a suicide pill, and he finally recognizes a grim truth. He is their legend. That is the meaning of the title of the book. This book flips the usual us versus them story into more of a morally ambiguous angle. Who is the real monster here? The contagious many, or the man who exterminates them? With this book, I think Matheson is trying to understand and explore otherness, and loneliness, and extinction, and adaptation. The terrifying thing about these vampires is that they herald a new normal, one that renders Homo sapiens obsolete. I Am Legend is of course highly influential, so influential it's hard to overstate. Its infection model helped seed the modern zombie genre. George A. Romano cited Matheson as the key inspiration for Night of the Living Dead, 1968.
Many apocalypse story tropes, the lone survivor, the infected spouse, the need to strike during daylight, can be traced back here.
Matheson showed that in an age of microscopes and blood tests, the core dread endures. The pandemic, the unknown pathogen, and of course, the fear that we will be replaced, remembered only as a legend by what comes next. Part 2. Blind Sight. I've talked about Blind Sight on this channel more than once. It's one of my favorite Peter Watts novels because it also gives vampires a really cool scientific, not occult foundation while keeping them extremely terrifying. Watts treats the vampire as an evolutionary design problem. In Blind Sight, vampires are essentially a parallel hominid, Homo sapiens vampirus. In the present time of the novel, they have been resurrected by gene therapy and corporate domestication programs. They are predators that diverged from us hundreds of thousands of years ago and were optimized to hunt humans. They have four-cone vision tuned to near-infrared, superior pattern matching from a sparsely cross-linked cortex, and physical advantages that make them stronger and faster than baseline humans. The novel, like I Am Legend, also attempts to rationalize the old folklore. Vampires don't drink blood because of a curse. They lack the ability to synthesize a crucial hominid protein, PCDHY, so they must obtain it from human blood or flesh. And also, bright light is a vulnerability of night-adapted eyes. And then there's of course the idea that vampires can't stand the sight of the cross. In Blind Sight, they have an aversion to right angles, the crucifix glitch, a seizure-triggering defect in the visual system. And in fact, this is the reason vampires went extinct the first time. Once humans filled their world with rectilinear architecture, the environment itself turned lethal and drove them to extinction. What I really like about Peter Watts' vampires is how their history was kind of folded into ecology. To avoid wiping out a slowly breeding food source, humans, these vampires hibernated for years or decades at a time, letting human numbers recover and memories fade into folklore. The cycle repeats, predators wake, feed, vanish, and the stories return. In those ancient days, only the very old may have any memories at all of the vampires coming. They would have young, unsuspecting flesh awaiting them when they awoke again. As I said, in the present time of the novel, genetic engineering brings back the vampires. The space vessel Theseus sails with a vampire commander, who kind of has this predatory calm that keeps the crew on edge. He is smarter than they are, and he reads patterns they cannot. Yet he seems emotionally blank, more like an instrument than a person. I think it revives the classic fear from a kind of Darwinian angle. They're being managed by something that might see them as livestock. And of course, this ties in to Blindsight's larger theme, intelligence versus consciousness. The commander's brilliance may be largely non-conscious, a killer algorithm in flesh. If so, you wouldn't be able to appeal to his mercy. He would have none. The horror of Blindsight's sci-fi vampires is the possibility that nature produced a cousin that outcompetes us, and that our self-aware minds are not the winning hand we think they are. Part 3. Fledgling. Octavia Butler's 2005 book Fledgling pushes the vampire myth into anthropology. It also explores genetics and ethics. Her vampires, the Ina, are not undead or cursed. They are an ancient, secretive species that co-evolved alongside humans. They drink human blood, but use venom that gives intense pleasure and forges a biochemical bond. The human symbiont grows healthier and long-lived, nearly disease-free while bonded. And the Ina gains a devoted, willing source of blood. Predator and partner exist at once.
The arrangement looks benevolent, and yet it erodes autonomy. If a human's chemistry is altered so they can't bear separation, then is consent really real? And it's also dangerous, because though the symbiont feels love and joy, they may also face dangerous withdrawals if the bond is broken.
The protagonist Shori is different, however. She is Ina, but genetically engineered with African human DNA that grants dark skin and resistance to the sunlight. After she's found burned and without her memory after the massacre of her family, she reconstructs her identity and culture while investigating who targeted them and why. She soon bonds with a human man, becoming his first experience of Ina symbiosis. As Shori relearns Ina society, the novel shades into questions of law and justice. Her existence is contested by conservative Ina, who view human genes as corruption. That was the hostility that fueled the murder of her family.
The fear in this book is the fear of losing agency while being cherished. Characters insist that communication and consent are necessary, and Shori tries to act ethically, asking before she feeds and respecting boundaries, and yet the imbalance remains.
Her bite rewires brains. Even with care and love, humans are bound by biology. The metaphor reaches beyond horror. This is about unequal relationships where protection and prosperity mask control. Part 4. Carrion Comfort. After Bram Stoker, a lot of writers tried to naturalize the vampire, to trade superstition for systems. Matheson made it microbial. Butler turned it into biology and community. Peter Watts treated it like a predatory branch of hominid. Dan Simmons, best known to many of you probably for Hyperion, takes a different route entirely. He keeps the monster human and moves the horror into history, politics, and media. The bite is replaced by leverage. Power lives in boardrooms, in studios, in covert agencies, and most importantly, in the minds of people who believe that they have the right to steer the rest of us. Carrion Comfort is Simmons asking what it would look like if that entitlement had a literal switch. In 1942, Saul Lasky survives Kelmno after discovering that an SS Oberst can seize his mind and use him as a chess piece. Haunted for decades, Saul hunts his psychic predator. In 1980, 3 psychic predators, Melanie, Nina, and Willie, meet to compare kills and statuses. The ability allows them to remotely control people and feed off of the violent acts they commit. They specifically feed off the emotional shock of the violence. After Willie's plane explodes, Melanie suspects Nina, and the two wage a public slaughter through puppeted bystanders. Nina is shot dead. Sheriff Gentry and the FBI agent Haynes probe the massacre and cross paths with Saul and a woman named Natalie, whose father had died in the crossfire. Saul recounts Kelmno and his long pursuit of the Oberst, who he believes to be the mind vampire Willie. They uncover the Island Club, which is a cabal of elites with the ability. They meddle in world events, including the 1980 US election. At the climax of the novel, as the Island Club convenes for their lethal games, Willie pushes to take the games global and proves that he can touch nuclear command. Willie is eventually thwarted by Saul, and the club boss is assassinated.
But this is not the end of the mind vampires. They still live on, as covert as ever. What makes this version of the vampire frightening is the casual erasure of will. The book keeps circling the same wound, that a person can be made to act, to hate, to love, to kill, and then be left holding the guilt for someone else's thrill.
This is the nightmare of being awake inside your own body, while another hand moves the pieces. On the societal level, the novel pushes an uglier idea, that many atrocities feel random only because we cannot see the people treating history like a game. The fear is that evil is efficient. It scales. It hides inside institutions and uses ordinary citizens as its conduit.
Dan Simmons's mind vampires make the metaphor plain.
If power feeds on fear and chaos, then the real horror is not the monster in the dark. It is the smiling professional who already has the key into your head. Conclusion. Modern sci-fi keeps the vampire alive by plugging it into problems we actually face.
Agency, power, and what happens when knowledge does not save us. You can see that range in 4 very different books.
Carrion Comfort turns vampirism into control of the will. People who look ordinary but hijack minds and feed on the fallout of fear and violence. Fledgling shifts the frame to intimacy and structure, a bond that heals and protects while narrowing choice. A relationship that feels consensual from the inside and coercive from the outside. I Am Legend makes the vampire a pandemic, a microbial logic that collapses the line between monster and victim. And Blindsight imagines a rival hominid built for predation, high intelligence, with little interest in empathy, a biological answer to the question of whether consciousness is actually an advantage.
The different stories and interpretations map different routes to the same nerves, so to speak. In Carrion Comfort, the fear is stolen agency that you never see coming. In Fledgling, it's the care that captivates, comfort that depends on inequality. In I Am Legend, it's the sick feeling that something that we set in motion, war, disease, whatever, will lead to a chain reaction that ultimately leaves us as the minority.
In Blindsight, it's the idea that something smarter and colder can outcompete us.
Taken together, these books say that the vampire is a predator of the body, but also a predator of boundaries. The body is violated by infection. The species is crossed by a superior cousin. The relationship is bent by dependency. The mind is overwritten by another mind.
If you put it in scientific terms and you use words like microbes and genes, cognition, then it lands even closer.
Because those forces already shape our lives. So if I answer the question, what does a vampire represent now? I would say this. It is the form our modern losses of agency take. Pandemic, predation, exploitation, manipulation. Different skins, the same function.
Something lives because it drains. That is why these stories endure.